"Dad, don't come to Christmas dinner. Just watch it on Livestream." Those words didn't just sting, they shattered years of sacrifice, love, and silent devotion. When betrayal arrives not with anger but with cold indifference, it cuts the deepest. And from that wound, a choice is born. Stay silent and keep giving, or finally draw a line that can never be crossed again. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I have lived 62 winters, and Denver's December chill has always carried a certain weight for me. The snow settles on rooftops and sidewalks in heavy blankets, and I can hear the faint crackle of wood burning in neighbors' fireplaces as I sip my morning coffee. My name is Richard Bennett, and I am a retired civil engineer. After 4 decades working on bridges and office towers, I thought retirement would be the reward for a life spent in hard hats and steel-toed boots. Instead, retirement has been a slower, quieter chapter, one in which I have been left mostly with my own thoughts and the echoes of what used to be. My house stands on a quiet street in a suburb just outside Denver. It is neither large nor luxurious, but it has always been enough. I bought it nearly 30 years ago when my wife Carol was still alive. We raised our son there, and for many years the rooms overflowed with noise. Birthday parties, school projects, late-night laughter spilling from the living room. Now, the halls are still. The hum of the furnace and the ticking of the old wall clock provide most of the soundtrack to my days. Carol has been gone 7 years. Cancer stole her from me far too soon, and although time has dulled the sharpness of grief, there are evenings when I still reach for her side of the bed. Each morning begins with the same ritual. I brew a pot of coffee, open the blinds to watch the sun struggle against gray clouds, and unfold the newspaper. Some days I tinker in the garage, fixing tools or polishing the old workbench. Other days I walk to the hardware store simply to wander the aisles, more for the comfort of routine than for anything I need to buy. Carol's garden remains my responsibility. I still trim the bushes she once adored and keep the bird feeder stocked. It makes me feel like a part of her is still here. I am, at my core, a father. David, my only son, is 35 now. He lives across town with his wife Laura and their 2 children, my grandchildren. I remember the day I handed him the keys to his first car, the day I stood in the pouring rain at his high school graduation, and the day I signed the check that made it possible for him to attend college without debt. I co-signed the mortgage on his first house and wrote him a generous check when he launched his interior design firm. Every milestone of his life has been tied in some way to my support. I never resented it. I believed it was what fathers were meant to do, clear the path so their children could walk without stumbling. Still, pride and loneliness make strange companions. On one hand, I feel accomplished knowing David has built a career, a family, and a life of his own. On the other, the holidays remind me of all that is missing. Carol adored Christmas. She strung lights along every window and insisted on baking too many pies. Since she passed, the holiday season has been more difficult. I cling to the memory of stockings hung over the fireplace, the smell of roast turkey filling the house, and the sound of carols humming from an old radio. I imagine my grandchildren sitting cross-legged on the rug while I read them the same stories I once read to David. The neighborhood itself makes it impossible to forget the season. Children run from house to house rehearsing for the school pageant, carrying paper crowns and plastic shepherd staffs. My neighbors hang lights that twinkle in steady rows, and wreaths appear on nearly every door. Even the air seems different, sharp with the smell of pine and smoke. I drive through the streets at night just to look at the displays, pretending for a moment that I am still part of that warmth. Yet beneath my anticipation, unease lingers. David has been distant lately. Our conversations have been shorter, more perfunctory. When I ask about his work, he brushes me off with vague assurances. When I mention Christmas plans, he changes the subject. I try not to overthink it, telling myself he is busy with his family and the business. But a father knows when something is off, and I cannot shake the feeling that this year will be different. As I sat by the window one frosty evening, candlelight flickering against Carol's framed photograph, I whispered to myself that this Christmas would be better. I pictured myself holding my grandchildren while snow piled outside, the living room filled with warmth and laughter. Hope has always been my anchor, even when reality suggests otherwise. But as the days crept closer to December 25th, the shadow of doubt grew longer. Something inside me stirred, though I could not name it yet. All I knew was that my faith in family, in the bond between father and son, was about to be tested in a way I had never imagined. If you're still watching and felt the sting of that betrayal, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. The morning had begun in the most ordinary way. Snow was drifting lazily outside, covering the neighborhood in a blanket of white, while the smell of fresh coffee filled my kitchen. I set out a single plate of toast, the kind of simple breakfast I had grown accustomed to since Carol passed. Through the window, I could see my neighbor stringing the last of his Christmas lights. It made me smile faintly, because it reminded me of how Carol always insisted ours had to be the brightest house on the block. For a moment, the air felt steady, familiar, and almost hopeful. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. I wiped my hands on a towel and glanced at the screen, expecting a weather alert or maybe a reminder from the pharmacy. Instead, it was a text from David, 14 words that split my morning wide open. "Dad, don't come to Christmas dinner. Just watch through Livestream, okay?" I stared at the message, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks. I reread it 3 times, waiting for some kind of emoji, a smile, a wink, anything that might signal this was a poorly executed joke. There was nothing, just the sharpness of those words sitting on my screen like frost that refused to melt. The cup in my hand trembled slightly, though I didn't spill a drop. My first instinct was to believe there had been a mistake. Maybe David meant to send it to someone else. Maybe his kids had grabbed his phone and typed nonsense. Yet as the seconds passed without a follow-up, I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. I thought back to the Christmases we had shared. Carol standing in the kitchen, flour dusting her sweater as she baked pies. David tearing through wrapping paper as a boy, his eyes bright with excitement. Even after Carol died, I tried to keep the traditions alive, hoping it would tether us together. Last year, I bought the grandkids matching sweaters and built them a wooden toy chest with my own hands. I thought those gestures meant something. Apparently, they didn't mean enough to secure me a seat at my son's table. The words "watch through Livestream" cut especially deep, as if I were some distant relative tuning in from across the country, not the man who had paid David's tuition, co-signed his mortgage, and sacrificed so much of my own life for his comfort. It felt like being erased. I didn't respond right away. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type. Anger would have been easier, but what I felt was heavier. A combination of disbelief, sorrow, and something that felt dangerously close to betrayal. I set the phone down on the counter beside the cooling plate of toast and sat back in my chair. Through the living room doorway, I could see the Christmas tree. I had decorated it a week earlier, using the ornaments Carol had collected over the years. Tiny wooden sleds, glass angels, a hand-painted star David made in kindergarten. The tree glowed softly against the dim morning light, a symbol of warmth and continuity. And yet, in contrast, that text message sat in my mind like a cold draft blowing straight through the center of the house. I thought about recent conversations with David. They had been shorter, more clipped. When I asked about the company, he said he was busy. When I mentioned Christmas dinner a few weeks back, he brushed it off with vague answers. I had ignored the unease then, chalking it up to stress. But now, the truth became clearer. This distance wasn't new. It had been building for months, maybe longer, and I hadn't wanted to see it. The snow outside thickened, softening the world into silence. I walked to the porch and stepped out, the cold biting my skin. Neighbors' houses glowed with cheerful decorations, wreaths on every door, lights strung across porches. It felt almost cruel that the season carried so much brightness while my own family ties were dimming. I whispered a question into the frosty air, one that barely left my lips but carried the full weight of my heart. How did we get here? There was no answer, only the crunch of snow beneath my boots as I stood staring at the street. Inside, the phone remained silent. No apology, no explanation. I knew then that this Christmas would not be like any other. Something fundamental had shifted, and though I could not yet see the full shape of what was coming, I sensed the ground beneath me had begun to crack. If you're still watching and can sense the silence before the storm, comment number 2 below so I know you're following along. The morning after that text, I woke before the sun had fully risen. The sky was still a dull gray, and the snow outside had crusted over into a hardened sheet. I brewed my usual pot of coffee, though the warmth of the kitchen did little to ease the chill inside me. My phone sat on the counter, silent, as though it had conspired to remind me of the words I could not erase. I tried to distract myself by reading the paper, but the words blurred. My mind returned to that text, again and again, as if prodding at a bruise that refused to heal. Out of habit, I opened my banking app to check my retirement accounts. It was something I did occasionally, not because I lived extravagantly, but because I liked knowing I was secure. A notification popped up, one I had nearly forgotten about. A transfer of $25,000 had cleared just last week. The purpose had been simple: renovations to David's house so it would be perfect for Christmas. The irony cut deep. I had paid to polish the very floors where I was no longer welcome to set foot. I leaned back in my chair, the bitterness rising like bile. How many times had I reached into my savings without hesitation? College tuition, the down payment on his first house, the seed money for his business. I never thought of those decisions as sacrifices at the time. They felt like extensions of love, a father's duty. Yet now, sitting in my quiet kitchen, it felt like I had been complicit in writing myself out of my own family's story. Memories came rushing back, times when David had mentioned needing loans or bridge funds, but had never offered details. I remembered Laura once praising him for being so resourceful, for managing everything on his own. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now I wondered. Had David hidden the truth of my support from his wife? Had my sacrifices been disguised as his accomplishments? The idea settled heavy in my chest, mixing shame with fury. I dressed, pulled on my heavy coat, and drove into town. The bank's parking lot was full of shoppers darting into nearby stores, arms full of glossy bags. The sight made me ache. Everyone seemed caught up in joy, while I trudged forward with betrayal burning in my veins. Inside the bank, the familiar scent of polished wood and the low hum of printers greeted me. Carlos, the branch manager, had known me for years. He shook my hand warmly, asking about the holidays. "I need to review my accounts," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We sat down at his desk, and as he typed, I saw it clearly on the screen. A scheduled transfer of $40,000 set to go out in a few days, earmarked for David's business expansion. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it represented. Another silent sacrifice. Another chance for David to lean on me without acknowledgement. Another opportunity to be erased behind the curtain of his pride. "Would you like to cancel it?" Carlos asked gently. I hesitated. For the first time in years, I did not answer immediately. I stared at the numbers on the screen, neat lines of digits that told the story of decades of labor. Bridges I had helped design, towers I had watched climb into the sky, all boiled down to this: a decision whether to keep funding a son who had told me to watch my family from a computer screen. "I'm not sure yet," I finally replied, "but I need to think about it." As I left the bank, the air bit at my face. Children's laughter spilled from the toy store across the street. Families bustled past me, carrying wreaths and candy canes, their voices light and merry. I stood there a moment, feeling the gap between their world and mine. To them, the season was about warmth and togetherness. To me, it had become a reminder of exclusion, a season of absence. That evening, as I settled into my chair with a glass of wine, the phone rang. The name on the screen made my chest tighten. David. His tone when I answered was not warm or apologetic. It was clipped, urgent, almost demanding. "Dad, we need to talk," he said. I knew then that the first line had been drawn. The ground beneath us was shifting, and this conversation would decide far more than just money. It would decide what kind of father I was willing to keep being and what kind of man I needed to become. If you're still watching and the shock of that discovery hit you hard, drop number 3 in the comments so I know you feel it too. When I hung up after that first call, I sat still for a long time, the phone resting heavily in my hand. David's voice echoed in my head, urgent, clipped, with no trace of warmth. He had not asked how I was or how I planned to spend Christmas alone. He had gone straight to the point: money. I poured myself a second glass of wine, not because I wanted it, but because the ritual gave my restless hands something to do. The phone rang again within the hour. I hesitated before answering, already bracing for what was coming. "Dad," David said sharply, "we need that transfer. You can't cancel it." His tone carried a kind of entitlement that pierced me more than the words themselves. I took a breath before answering. "I haven't canceled it yet, but I'm thinking about it." Silence on the line, then his voice rose. "Thinking about it? Dad, this isn't just about me. The company needs it, and Laura's family is expecting a perfect holiday. If the money doesn't go through, everything falls apart." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the corner. "Funny," I said, my voice even. "You tell me not to come to Christmas dinner, but you still expect me to pay for it. Do you hear the contradiction?" His sigh crackled through the line. "This isn't about dinner. It's about survival. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." I clenched my jaw, but I kept my voice calm. "I understand more than you think. I worked 40 years under pressure, and I always made sure you never felt it. But now you're telling me my presence isn't wanted. Only my money is. That doesn't sit right with me." David's reply cut sharper than I expected. "You always make everything about yourself, Dad. This is exactly why Laura thinks—" He stopped short, but the damage was done. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Everything about myself, the tuition I paid, the mortgage I co-signed, the checks I wrote in silence, had those all been about me? For a moment, I wondered if he even remembered the nights I stayed up late calculating bills, the weekends I skipped vacations so he could have opportunities I never did. "David," I said quietly, "all I ever wanted was to be part of your life. Not as a wallet, as your father. That text you sent me, telling me not to come, telling me to watch through a screen, it was the cruelest thing you've ever said." He exhaled loudly, impatience dripping from his voice. "Look, we can talk about Christmas later. Right now, I need you to follow through with the transfer. Otherwise, the business could collapse, and Laura's family will never forgive me. Do you want to ruin everything?" I stared at Carol's picture on the mantel. Her eyes in that photo always reminded me of the evenings we sat up late, whispering about how David would grow into a good man. I wanted to believe those whispers had come true. "I'm not sure what I'll do yet," I said finally, "but I won't be pressured into making a decision tonight." "Dad, please," he began, but I ended the call before he could finish. My hand shook as I set the phone down. I sat in the silence of my living room, listening to the hum of the furnace and the faint ticking of the clock. The calm around me felt like a shell over a storm. I tried to imagine alternatives. Could I suggest a small celebration, just me and the grandkids a day before Christmas? Could I show up with gifts and hope they softened Laura's stance? But deep down, I knew the truth. David wasn't interested in compromise. He had made it clear that my seat at the table was negotiable, but my money was not. The thought hollowed me out. I looked at the glowing ornaments, each one a memory of a life when family still meant something. I whispered softly to the photograph on the mantel, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "What do I want?" It was the first time I had asked myself that question in years. If you're still watching and the weight of those cruel words struck a chord, type number 4 below so I know you're still here. The days ticked closer to Christmas, and the weight in my chest grew heavier. Every shop window I passed was dressed in twinkling lights and wreaths, the streets filled with children dragging sleds across the snow, their laughter echoing against the cold sky. Yet inside me, there was no joy, only the steady beat of anticipation Anticipation not for celebration, but for confrontation. I knew I had to make a decision about the transfer. On December 22nd, I drove to the bank. The snow had hardened into icy patches, and the tires crunched loudly as I pulled into the lot. Inside, the warmth of the lobby contrasted with the frost still clinging to my coat. Carlos greeted me with his usual professionalism, though his eyes seemed to sense my unease. "Back again, Mr. Bennett?" he asked kindly. "Yes," I replied. "I need to cancel the transfer I scheduled for my son's business." $40,000. He hesitated for a moment, perhaps expecting me to waver, but I didn't. My signature was steady as I filled out the form. When he confirmed the cancellation, I felt something unexpected. Relief, not guilt, not fear, just relief. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line that David could not cross. By the time I returned home, my phone was buzzing relentlessly. David had called 6 times before I even stepped inside. I let the calls go unanswered, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down in the living room. Finally, I picked up on the 7th ring. "Dad, what the hell did you do?" His voice cracked with panic. I kept my tone calm. I canceled the transfer. "You can't do that. Do you understand what this means? Without that money, the company could go under." I closed my eyes, steadying myself. "Then maybe it's time you face the truth about your company. It's not my responsibility to save it." His voice rose, sharp with desperation. "You're betraying me, your own son. How could you do this right before Christmas?" I let the accusation settle for a beat before I answered. "Betrayal works both ways, David. You told me not to come to Christmas dinner. You reduced me to a spectator in my own family. You wanted my money, not my presence. That's betrayal." There was silence on the line, broken only by his ragged breathing. Then he shouted, "You don't understand. Laura's parents are furious. They're saying I can't handle my responsibilities. If you had just followed through, none of this would have happened." I almost laughed at the absurdity, but instead, my voice hardened. "So, I'm good enough to keep your wife's parents impressed, but not good enough to sit at the table with them? Do you even hear yourself?" He tried to twist the argument, his words tumbling quickly. "I needed the money to cover debts. The company isn't as stable as I made it seem. Laura doesn't know. If she finds out, she'll lose faith in me. Her family will never respect me again. You've put me in an impossible situation." There it was, the truth, ugly and raw. He hadn't wanted the transfer for expansion or opportunity. He wanted it to hide failure, to mask reality with my hard-earned savings. I felt the anger rise, hot and sharp, but I didn't let it spill out. Instead, I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "I have spent my entire life cleaning up your messes, paying for your choices, sacrificing my own needs for yours. But I will not bankroll lies, not anymore." His voice cracked again, but this time with rage. "You're destroying me, Dad. Don't you get it? You're ruining everything." "No," I said firmly. "I'm letting you stand on your own for once. If that feels like ruin, maybe you need to ask yourself why." There was a pause, long and tense. Then he spat out, "You're not the father I thought you were." I almost answered, but instead I pressed the button and ended the call. The silence that followed was deafening, but in that silence I felt something new: freedom. For years, guilt had been the chain binding me to every demand, every plea. Now, the chain had snapped. I stood, walked to the mantel, and looked at Carol's picture. Her gentle smile seemed to watch over me, steady and unwavering. For once, I didn't ask what she would want me to do. I whispered instead, "I did what I had to." My heart pounded, but I didn't regret it. For the first time, I had chosen dignity over duty. And though the cost was high, I knew this was only the beginning of what would come. The morning after the argument with David, I woke to a heavy stillness that felt almost unnatural. The snow outside had piled high overnight, muffling every sound beyond my windows. For years, I had associated that kind of silence with loneliness. But that morning, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I noticed something different. It felt like a pause, a clean break, as though the world had been stripped down so I could finally decide where to go from here. David's last words clung to me like frost. "You're not the father I thought you were." They replayed over and over in my mind as I shuffled into the kitchen. I brewed my coffee, the gurgling machine almost too loud in the quiet house. I leaned on the counter, cradling the warm mug in my hands, and thought about what those words really meant. For most of my life, my role as father had been defined by what I gave: money, time, effort, stability. If I wasn't giving, did that mean I wasn't a father at all? My phone blinked with a string of new messages. David had called several times after our fight, and I had ignored each attempt. Now his texts were waiting like small landmines. "Dad, please reconsider. If you love us, you'll do this. You're being cruel." There were others too, harsher and more desperate. One from Laura arrived in a tone so cold it could have frozen the screen. "Richard, the family was counting on you. This isn't the time to back out. Not a word of concern for me, not a trace of affection, just expectation." I set the phone face down on the counter. The urge to respond buzzed in my fingertips, but I resisted. For years I had always answered, always picked up the phone, always jumped at the first sign of need. And where had it left me? Excluded from Christmas dinner, treated like an ATM that happened to have a pulse. I sank into my chair at the kitchen table and let my thoughts wander. Images of my past played through my head like an old film reel, standing on construction sites at midnight in the freezing cold, balancing project deadlines while trying to make it home in time to see David before he fell asleep, signing checks that should have gone into my retirement account, but instead went to cover his tuition, his mortgage, his dreams. I had built bridges in my career, but I had also built a bridge for my son's entire life, one sturdy enough for him to walk across without ever noticing the weight it carried. But this text, this exclusion, it had changed everything. I was no longer willing to bear the weight if it meant disappearing in the process. Later that afternoon, I bundled up and took a walk through the neighborhood. Snow crunched under my boots, the air sharp against my face. Families were outside decorating together. I passed one house where a father lifted his little girl onto his shoulders so she could hang a star on the tree in their yard. She giggled, clapping her mittened hands as her mother cheered. The sight filled me with both ache and clarity. I envied their closeness, but I also realized something crucial. That kind of love couldn't be bought. It wasn't about money or sacrifice. It was about respect, about showing up for each other in ways that mattered. As I walked, I whispered to myself, "Love without respect isn't love at all." The words felt foreign, but true. I had poured myself into my son's life, but if he could dismiss me so easily, then perhaps what bound us wasn't love anymore. It was dependency. And dependency was not enough reason to keep sacrificing pieces of myself. When I returned home, I hung up my coat and sat down at my desk. My email was still open from the night before, the scheduled transfer sitting there like a threat. My cursor hovered over the confirmation link. I could feel the weight of decades pressing on me, whispering that fathers don't walk away, that fathers give no matter what. But I thought of Carol. I thought of her quiet wisdom, the way she would sometimes place her hand on mine when I was overworking and say, "Richard, you can't fix everything." With a steady breath, I clicked delete. The scheduled transfer vanished. A clean break. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The house was still, the tree lights glowing faintly in the living room. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and carried it to the couch. Sitting there, I spoke aloud, the words sounding strange yet liberating. "This year, I choose me." The silence answered back, not with loneliness, but with peace. If you're still watching and the choice between dignity and guilt kept you hooked, write number 6 in the comments so I know you're here. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow. By late afternoon, the neighborhood looked like something out of a postcard. Rooftops lined in white, trees draped with shimmering icicles, and lights glowing from every porch. Children bundled in coats dragged sleds across the sidewalks, their laughter carrying through the crisp air. Inside my house, though, the stillness was almost absolute. It was not the hollow kind of silence that had haunted me in years past. It was a silence of choice, of distance that I had finally claimed for myself. My phone had not stopped buzzing since morning. Dozens of missed calls, a string of voicemails that I refused to open. The little red notification light blinked stubbornly, as if trying to guilt me into obedience. I turned the phone face down on the kitchen counter and walked away. I had lived too many years answering every demand without question. Not this time. From fragments of conversation with neighbors and a message from an old acquaintance who still kept in touch with David, I learned how badly things were unraveling. The caterer had backed out after not receiving final payment. The florist, too, had canceled their delivery. The grand dinner David and Laura had promised her parents was collapsing before it could begin. Laura's family, apparently, was furious, humiliated by the sudden chaos, whispering about David's incompetence. There was a time when hearing that news would have crushed me. I would have rushed to the bank, begged them to release the funds, and done whatever it took to preserve appearances. But sitting in my chair by the fire, I realized something remarkable. I didn't feel guilty. Instead, I felt a bittersweet calm. My son was suffering the consequences of choices he had made, and for once, I was not stepping in to shield him. The ache of absence was still there. I thought of my grandchildren, probably confused by the tension in their home. I missed their laughter, their small hands tugging at my sleeves. Yet even that longing couldn't erase the clarity that had taken root in me. Love did not mean enabling lies. Respect could not be bought with $40,000. As evening fell, I lit a single candle beside Carol's photograph on the mantel. The soft flame flickered against her smile, casting shadows that made her look almost alive. I poured a glass of red wine, the bottle one we had once saved for a holiday we never got to share. Old carols played faintly from the radio, their melodies filling the quiet house. The loneliness was real, but it was no longer suffocating. It felt almost like strength. I pictured David's house across town. The arguments, the frantic calls to vendors, Laura's parents glaring across a half-decorated dining room. The contrast between their chaos and my peace was stark. For so many years, I had confused noise with love, obligation with family. That night, I saw clearly how wrong I had been. The doorbell rang just after 9. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, assuming it was another attempt by David, but curiosity tugged at me. When I opened the door, the winter wind swept in, carrying a dusting of snowflakes. Standing there was Thomas, an old friend from my construction days. His face was older now, lines carved deep by time, but his eyes still carried that same steady warmth. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "Thought I'd check in on you." We shared a brief conversation in the doorway, nothing too heavy. He asked how retirement was treating me, mentioned that he had been working on a small project, and hinted at opportunities that might need someone with my experience. It wasn't a job offer exactly, but it was a reminder that my life didn't have to be defined by rejection or by my son's choices. Before leaving, Thomas clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Don't be a stranger, Rich. We've still got work left in us, you know." When I closed the door behind him, I felt something shift. The visit had been brief, but it planted a seed. Perhaps this season of loss could also be a season of beginnings. Later, I stepped outside onto the porch, the snow crunching beneath my slippers. The night was cold, but the stars burned bright above. Across the street, lights twinkled from a neighbor's window. Their family gathered around a tree. For once, I didn't envy them. I simply stood there, watching the glow, and knew that I had chosen the harder path, but the right one. Christmas morning dawned in silence. I woke slowly, not to the sound of children tearing through wrapping paper or the aroma of a grand meal in the oven, but to the stillness of a house at peace. The snow outside had fallen thick overnight, blanketing the world in a kind of hushed reverence. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the absence as a wound. I felt it as space I had chosen, space I could fill with something new. I padded into the kitchen and brewed my coffee, the machine sputtering and hissing like an old friend. I toasted a slice of bread, fried an egg, and sat by the window with my simple breakfast. Light streamed across the snowy yard, turning the drifts into shimmering mounds of silver. In the quiet, I allowed myself to breathe without guilt. There were no frantic calls to answer, no bills to cover on someone else's behalf, no dinners to attend where I was tolerated more than welcomed. I knew, of course, that David and Laura's holiday had crumbled. The calls and messages I ignored told me enough. The caterer gone, the florist canceled, the anger of Laura's parents simmering into outright disdain. Part of me grieved for the grandchildren caught in the crossfire, but the larger part of me understood something vital. I was no longer responsible for cushioning David from the weight of his own choices. For the first time in decades, the burden wasn't mine to carry. The phone rang mid-morning, its screen lighting up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Thomas. He had stopped by briefly the night before, a quiet gesture of friendship, but now his voice carried purpose. "Rich, I meant what I said yesterday," he told me. "A few of us old hands are starting a consulting group. Smaller projects, part-time work, nothing like the grind we used to know. We could use someone with your eye for detail and your leadership. What do you think?" I sat back, the phone pressed to my ear, my heart unexpectedly quickening. For a moment, hesitation crept in. I was 62. Did I still have the energy? Did I want to step back into a world of deadlines and blueprints? But beneath the doubt was something else. An ember I hadn't felt in years. Excitement. The thought of being valued not for the size of my bank account, but for the skill of my mind and the steadiness of my hands. "I'll think about it," I said, though in truth I already knew. After the call, I climbed into the attic and pulled down a box of ornaments Carol had packed away long ago. Dust clung to the cardboard, but inside lay memories preserved in glass and wood. I held a delicate snowflake she once loved, turning it slowly in the light. For years, I had kept these relics tucked away, afraid that using them without her would feel like betrayal. But as I stood there, I realized the opposite was true. Honoring her memory didn't mean living in stasis. Carol would never have wanted me to freeze in grief or obligation. She would have wanted me to live, to keep building, not bridges of steel this time, but bridges toward a fuller life. Back downstairs, I placed a few of the ornaments on the tree, their colors glowing softly against the lights. I poured another cup of coffee and sat with my journal, an old leather-bound book I hadn't touched in years. The pen felt strange in my hand at first, but soon the words came. I choose to live for myself now, not for guilt, not for obligation, for me. I closed the book gently, as if sealing a pact with myself. The weight on my shoulders felt lighter, replaced by a steadiness I had almost forgotten existed. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with movement. Families gathering, children laughing, carols drifting from open doors. I didn't feel excluded anymore. I felt free. My life no longer revolved around being someone else's safety net. For the first time in decades, Christmas morning wasn't about what I had lost. It was about what I had found, a path forward, one I would walk on my own terms. If you're still watching and found hope in that spark of renewal, comment number 8 so I know you've stayed with me. The weeks after Christmas settled over Denver like a slow thaw. Snowbanks turned to slush, lights disappeared from rooftops, and neighbors carried their discarded trees to the curb. For most, life slid naturally back into routine. For me, the quiet that followed felt different, firmer, more deliberate. I had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. I thought often about how the holiday had unfolded for David and Laura. News traveled quickly in our small community. One of my neighbors, who happened to know Laura's cousin, shared in hushed tones how the Christmas dinner at their house had unraveled. The caterer never arrived, the florist refused to deliver without payment, and Laura's parents sat at a table half-dressed, with dishes thrown together at the last minute. Guests whispered, children grew restless, and Laura's parents left early in embarrassment. For a family obsessed with appearances, the humiliation was brutal. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Laura had discovered the truth, that David's company was floundering, that the promised expansion was nothing more than a facade propped up by the money I had always provided. When the transfer failed to appear, his lie collapsed. Arguments erupted behind closed doors. Some of the neighbors had heard shouting through the walls. Laura's parents no longer trusted him, and her father reportedly said he would never again invest a cent in David's ventures. What had been hidden for years was now laid bare, and there was no patching over the cracks. I should have felt vindicated, but what I felt instead was a strange calm. I no longer carried the responsibility of saving him from himself. That burden, heavy as iron, had been lifted. For decades, I had been the silent rescuer, swooping in with checks and assurances. This time, I did nothing. And though the outcome was painful for David, it was also necessary. He had to stand on his own or fall. David sent me messages in the aftermath, though I read them only once before setting them aside. Some were tinged with anger, accusing me of betrayal. Others were laced with guilt, asking why I would abandon him now, when he needed me most. But threaded between them was something new, a trace of vulnerability, a recognition that perhaps he had leaned too hard for too long. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but out of a deep conviction that answering would only pull me back into the cycle. Silence, I realized, was the firmest answer I could give. While his world unraveled, mine began to rebuild. Thomas called again after the holiday, this time with a concrete proposal. He and 2 other retired engineers had secured a modest contract consulting on municipal projects. Bridges, water systems, things we all knew like the backs of our hands. "It won't be heavy lifting," he said. "Just brains, not boots. We need someone steady, someone who knows how to lead." I hesitated, but only briefly. When I accepted, a spark lit inside me that I hadn't felt in years. The first meeting was simple. Papers spread across a diner table, steaming mugs of coffee between us. Yet, as we pored over drawings and debated design choices, I felt alive. My opinion mattered not because of my bank balance, but because of my experience. For the first time since Carol died, I felt useful in a way that fed me instead of draining me. The rhythm of my days shifted. Mornings began with reviewing reports, afternoons with meetings at City Hall or conversations with old colleagues who still respected my judgment. Evenings, I returned to my quiet home, no longer weighed down by guilt or expectation. I realized that life could still expand, even in my 60s. I could still contribute, still build, still live. Of course, there were moments of ache. I thought of my grandchildren often, wondering if they asked where I was, why Grandpa hadn't come to Christmas. I worried they might hear only Laura's version of events. Yet, even that fear could not drag me back into the old pattern. If I gave in now, the lesson would be lost. Sometimes love demands distance, even when it hurts. One night in mid-January, I sat in my living room with the tree still glowing faintly, its ornaments catching the last flicker of holiday spirit. I hadn't taken it down yet, not because I was clinging to the season, but because I enjoyed its quiet beauty. I sipped my coffee and looked around the room, the warmth of the fire spreading across the walls. For the first time in a long time, I felt at home in my own life. The outcome was clear. I had lost something. Illusions of a son who valued me as more than a provider. But I had gained something greater: freedom, dignity, and the ability to define myself outside of sacrifice. I had stepped away from dependency disguised as love and walked toward a life of authenticity. That night, I wrote in my journal again, "A father gives because he loves. But love without respect becomes chains. I choose freedom." When I closed the book, I knew I had taken the first step into a future that was mine alone. The first weeks of the new year carried with them a calm I hadn't known in decades. The snow remained thick on the ground, muffling every sound, but inside me, there was no longer the ache of isolation. There was only clarity. I had crossed a threshold, and though I couldn't undo the hurt of the past, David's rejection, the collapse of our holiday traditions, I could finally see the truth with open eyes. I sat one evening in the living room, a fire crackling low in the hearth. The Christmas tree was still up, its lights casting a soft glow across the room. Some might have thought it odd to keep it so long after the holiday, but for me, it wasn't about tradition anymore. It was about the reminder that even in a season of loss, there could be light. Looking back, I understood something I had been too afraid to admit for years. Love cannot be measured by the size of a check, or the number of sacrifices quietly made in the dark. Love must be rooted in respect, in reciprocity, in the willingness to show up for one another. Without those things, sacrifice becomes nothing more than exploitation. And I had been exploited, though I hadn't wanted to use that word before. I had convinced myself that giving without question was noble. Now I understood it for what it was, an erasure of myself. When David told me not to come to Christmas dinner, to just watch through Livestream, it shattered the illusion I had clung to. I had believed that every check I wrote, every hour I worked late, every vacation I canceled was an investment in a bond that could not break. But bonds do break when one side is carrying all the weight. That text was cruel, but in its cruelty, it gave me the clarity I needed. It showed me that my love had become invisible, taken for granted until it was nothing more than a background hum. I thought often about the man I used to be, the father who answered every call, who felt fear at the thought of being unwanted, who defined his worth entirely by how much he could give. That man had lived in the shadow of guilt, terrified that withholding would mean losing his son's affection. He was always one check away from acceptance, one sacrifice away from love. But the man I was becoming was different. I was no longer afraid of silence. I was no longer willing to trade dignity for a seat at a table where I wasn't truly welcome. Solitude, once unbearable, had become a sanctuary. In solitude, I found strength. I also found a new sense of purpose. My work with Thomas and the small consulting group gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: value. Not the transactional kind tied to money, but the kind that comes from being recognized for knowledge, wisdom, and experience. Sitting in those meetings, sketching designs, answering questions, I felt like myself again. Not a bank, not a ghost of obligation, but Richard Bennett, engineer, problem solver, man of integrity. In quiet moments, I realized this story was not mine alone. Across America, in small towns and big cities, there are parents who gave everything so their children would never feel the sting of struggle. Parents who missed birthdays, who worked 2 jobs, who handed over savings they should have kept. They do it out of love, but too often, that love is twisted into expectation. Too often, their worth becomes tied to what they provide rather than who they are. To those parents, I would say this: you are more than what you give. Your value does not vanish when you stop paying. You do not have to burn yourself to keep others warm. Love is not real if it only exists when you are useful. I keep a journal now. It sits on the table beside me, leather-bound and worn from my hand resting on it night after night. A few weeks ago, I wrote words that have become my quiet promise. I choose to live for myself now, not for guilt, not for obligation. For me, each time I read those words, I feel steadier. They remind me that my story did not end with rejection. It began there. On one of the last nights of January, I sat with the journal open, the tree lights still glowing softly, even though most neighbors had packed theirs away. Carol's photograph watched over me from the mantel, the candle beside it flickering gently. I whispered the final thought that had carried me through. You don't have to burn yourself to keep others warm. It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't triumph, it was simply truth. And in that truth, I found peace. There comes a point in every life when the quiet truths speak louder than all the noise that came before. It is the point when sacrifice, once worn as a badge of honor, begins to feel like a chain. For many, the instinct to give is so deeply ingrained that it becomes second nature. Time, money, energy, even the small pleasures of living. These are poured out endlessly in the name of love and duty. Yet love, real love, cannot survive on sacrifice alone. It requires respect, recognition, and the willingness to meet halfway. Without that balance, what begins as generosity hardens into exploitation. The story of giving everything without pause is as old as parenthood itself. Entire generations have built their lives around the success of others, quietly shouldering burdens in the shadows, so that someone else can step into the light. But when the gratitude fades, when respect is absent, the giver begins to disappear in plain sight. What remains is not connection, but obligation, not affection, but dependency. The lesson lies not in how much one can endure, but in knowing when endurance ceases to serve love. Life, after all, is not meant to be measured by the endless tally of what has been given away. It is measured in dignity, in peace, in the ability to stand upright even when the world insists you kneel to its demands. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of preservation, a way of saying, my worth is not determined by what I provide, but by who I am. In that declaration lies a freedom that cannot be purchased, borrowed, or taken. It can only be claimed. There is a quiet strength in choosing to step back, in refusing to be manipulated by guilt or tradition. It is the strength of reclaiming the self after years of being defined by others. The moment one realizes that presence should never be negotiable, that affection should never depend on financial contribution, everything changes. What once felt like loss transforms into clarity. The silence that follows rejection is no longer empty. It becomes a sanctuary. The broader lesson reaches far beyond one home, one family, or one holiday. It speaks to anyone who has ever been made to feel invisible despite years of sacrifice. It is a reminder that love without respect is not love, that relationships built on leverage are destined to fracture, and it offers a truth as steady as winter snow. You cannot save others by erasing yourself. In the quiet aftermath of broken expectations comes a new kind of beginning, the opportunity to redirect energy inward, to discover passions and purposes left waiting on the shelf. Perhaps it is old skills awakened in a new venture. Perhaps it is the peace of a hobby once neglected, or the warmth of friendships untied to obligation. Whatever form it takes, this beginning grows from the decision to choose dignity over dependency. The journey is not without sorrow. To set boundaries often means facing the ache of distance, the sting of being misunderstood, the weight of silence where laughter once lived. Yet within that ache lies the seed of strength. To endure rejection while holding firm to self-worth is to discover the deepest form of resilience. It is to realize that peace does not come from clinging tighter to those who do not see you. It comes from loosening your grip and standing whole on your own. Every season of life carries its own wisdom, and the later chapters are no exception. They remind us that time is too precious to be spent appeasing those who only measure us by utility. The years that remain are not for being consumed, but for being lived, with intention, with grace, and with the courage to demand respect in all relationships. Choosing oneself is not abandonment. It is the highest act of honoring the life that has been hard-earned. In the end, the lesson is both simple and profound. You do not have to burn yourself to keep others warm. Love that asks for such sacrifice is not love at all. It is consumption. True love allows space for dignity, for mutual respect, for the freedom to exist not as a resource, but as a human being of full worth. To embrace this truth is to step into peace, to finally rest in the knowledge that you are enough without having to prove it, buy it, or beg for it. The lights of any holiday, the glow of any gathering may fade, but the light that comes from self-respect shines long after the season has passed. It is steady, unwavering, and entirely one's own. In that light lies the truest gift, the chance to live the remaining years, not as an echo of someone else's expectations, but as a clear and unbroken voice. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.